This is the 7th video in the Fluent Validation series. And in it, we're going to take a look at lifting our validations up into some of the higher levels of the application. And in particular, looking at how we might do validation at the level of ASP.NET controllers in an ASP.NET MVC style application or web service. So let's start by revisiting our architecture diagram. At the very beginning, we looked at some validation techniques here at the storage level in the SQL database. And then we spent most of our time developing a way to do validations using the Fluent Validation library here in our middle tier DLL in Loan System Lib. Now, many of you are probably working with applications that use the ASP.NET MVC pattern. Maybe it's a full MVC app with Razor pages, or maybe it's just an MVC-based controller doing a REST web service. And that's kind of what I've got here. I've got a little, there's no UI here. This is just a web service delivering a REST API written in ASP.NET. So there is a lot of, there are a lot of examples and a lot of code showing validation happening at this level. So I thought I would take a look at how we would use Fluent Validation to kind of pull our validation up one level. So for starters, let's just pop over to Visual Studio. And you can see here, I've got my loan system web service. Now, up till now, all of our testing has been, I've been running it through the CLI, but let's go ahead and run it down the other side here through our other interface. And I've set this loan system web service to be the startup project. And if I do Control F5, it should spin up a browser. And I have got this thing configured with Swagger, which gives us a way to interact with the web service without having to put an actual UI on it. We could also use a tool like Postman or curl to do the same thing, but Swagger's very convenient. And you can see here are the 3 endpoints that we defined in our controllers. And if I open this up here, I can click Try It Out, and I can say, okay, let's pass in a social security number, and let's give it a good one. At least a good one according to our validation rules. And let's call this person Pankaj Gupta. And we'll go ahead and execute this. This is going to send a post. And if we look at the response, we got back 200, which means success. And if we open up our SQL analyzer and we run the query, there it is. You can see that Pankaj has been added. So for another example, just to make sure you understand what's going on here, let's go to our loan endpoint, and we can try that one out, and we can put in this new social security number. And let's go ahead and loan $250 and execute. And we got success. So we'll query once again, and there's the loan we just made. And we can also cause our validation failures to happen. So let's go back here to the first one, and we can put in bad social security number and just leave the name blank and click execute. And now we get a server response 500, undocumented, internal server error, and we have all of this information about what went wrong. So as you can see, our validations are working, and it makes sense. If we go back to the diagram, you can see that the loan system web service is using the loan system library, which is doing the validations. So this is an important point. If you implement your validation here in this kind of DLL, then you get it wherever you use that DLL. You don't have to worry about it. But maybe, there's a reason why you don't want to have a separate DLL, or you've got an existing system that doesn't have that, and you want to validate here. So now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about implementing the Fluent validation code at the ASP.NET Core level. And conveniently, Fluent validation has a little help file here. And what you can see is they say there are several approaches for doing this, and they enumerate 3 of them: manual validation, automatic validation using the ASP.NET validation pipeline, and automatic validation using a filter. So here's the catch. Here's the fly in the ointment. If we scroll down and we look at the section of this article on automatic validation, you'll notice this warning. We no longer recommend using this approach for new projects, but it's still available for legacy implementations. So I'm not going to bother with it. We could take the time to get it going, but it's no longer recommended. It's essentially deprecated. So why? And then if we scroll down to the section on using a filter, what you'll notice is that support for this approach isn't provided out of the box, but you can use a third-party library. Well, I've never tested this out. Perhaps it works, I'm not sure. But again, it just seems like a lot of hassle when we do have the very clean and easy manual validation approach. So that's what I'm going to show you now. So to implement this, first step, let's turn off our existing validation. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to simply comment out the line of code here that creates our validator, and I'm going to comment out the line of code that uses the validator. This is in our customer.cs class, and we can go ahead and build that. And now if we were to run this through either the CLI or the web service, these validations, these rules would no longer be applied. So now what we need to do is write a little code into our web service. So the first file that we need to visit is the program.cs file. And I'm going to just copy and paste the code so I don't have to type so much. Oh, I'm sorry, I did skip a step. We have to let this project know that we're using Fluent validation. So the very first step is to go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, Manage Packages, choose the Fluent validation, choose your web service, and make sure that it is installed for that project. Great. And now we can say that we are using Fluent validation and using Lone System Lib. And here, right before we actually build our app, we're going to register our validation, our validators, we'll just call it. So we do builder.services.addScoped, iValidator, and then I've added both of our validators here, the customer DTO validator and the lone DTO validator. So that lets the sort of ASP.NET pipeline, the middleware piece, know that those things exist. Then the next thing we do is we go to our actual customer, the customer controller. My bad. So here's our customer controller. And as you can see, right now, it's just calling the library. So we will say using Fluent validation. And this class, the customer controller, we're going to give it a private validator. And we are also going to give it now a constructor. And the constructor has this iValidator of the type, or that targets a customer DTO as an input, and it wires up this validator. So the ASP.NET kind of runtime, or the, that middleware pipeline, it's going to now that we registered this, it's going to pass that in, and you're going to get this validator wired up for you. And then the last step is you have to use it. And this is what they mean by manual validation. So we can say validator.validate and throw, and we'll pass in our customer. So this really looks a lot like what we did in the library. It's just that instead of instantiating this thing ourselves as a static resource that kind of is shared among all callers, it's instantiated on the fly by the runtime and passed in to the controller. So let's see if this all now builds. Fantastic. So I'm just going to set a breakpoint right here, and I'm going to do F5. And this is going to now bring up our Swagger page. And let's go ahead and let's attempt to add a customer. So we'll do try it out, and we can just say bad and bad. And we will execute this. So our breakpoint hits. And you'll notice that the validator has been instantiated. So now when I do F5, we're going to get an exception. Boom, unhandled exception. F5 to keep running. And we get 5,000 undocumented internal server error. So the end result here is exactly the same. It's just that we haven't relied on the library to do the validation. Now I want to show you a little thing that can make this a little nicer. And you can use this regardless of where you put your validators. So that, that result, 500, that's kind of bad, right? That just means there was some sort of massive problem. And it would be nice to return something a little bit better. So for that, and this is really just about ASP.NET, I've got this class here, and I'm going to uncomment it. This is what's called a custom exception filter. So I've declared this class called exception filter, which is an iAction filter and an iOrdered filter. And what I've done here is I've intercepted in onActionExecuted. I've said, okay, if the exception that we're handling is a FluentValidation exception, then don't do that 500. In this case, we can return a 400 bad request. So that just intercepts it. And then to make this work, we have to, I'm going to comment out one line here, or uncomment it, under when we add our controllers, we have to add a controller option where we add the filter for our custom exception filter. So this is just a general purpose technique. And what I'm going to do now is Control F5, which will run this, but not in the debugger. And I'm going to go ahead and we'll try this out one last time, and we can do bad and execute. And now we get 400, error, bad request. And instead of that whole stack trace and all that massive nonsense we'd have to parse through, we actually just get our simple exception from the Fluent validation library. So that is a way you can now implement your validations here in your controller classes if you want to.